I came to the University of Toronto in the fall of 1967. I came direct from Calgary, where I had been born and raised and which I had hardly ever left. By contrast with Calgary, Toronto struck me as an exciting and cosmopolitan city, with its wonderful ethnic mix, its restaurants with cuisine from every country in the world, its first-rate symphony orchestra, its first-rate jazz clubs, and so on. I have to add that after living in Europe for over 40 years, Toronto doesn't seem quite so cosmopolitan today as it seemed to me in 1967, but it still seems a pretty exciting place to live. Even more exciting was the Center for Medieval Studies, then recently established, where I had been accepted for work on a PhD in medieval Latin. I felt at home here from the very beginning, not least because John Lyerly, the dynamic and charismatic late director of the center, had told me when I applied that I was just the sort of applicant the center had hoped to attract. The excitement mounted when I went to my first class in medieval Latin. I knocked on the door to a room in 39 Queen's Park Crescent East over here and was welcomed by the words, "In gradere quaeso." It took me some minutes to realize that this was Latin for "please come in," and that the class was being conducted entirely in Latin. It soon became clear that spoken Latin was a poor medium for novices trying to ask questions about points of grammar, but I have never forgotten the sense of exhilaration I felt in those first few Latin classes. And it hardly mattered if the classes were ineffective, because at the same time I had classes with Brian Stock, who gave a sound orientation in medieval Latin literature and who became my doctoral supervisor. From the very outset, I had hoped to use Toronto as a springboard to travel to European universities and libraries, to Cambridge and Paris in particular. In this respect, Brian Stock was a marvelous supervisor, because he had contacts, so it seemed, with every medieval Latin scholar in Europe, but especially in Cambridge and Paris. And so after doing my coursework here, I made my way to Cambridge. While in Cambridge, I began looking at manuscripts, first in the university library, then in college libraries. And among the subjects I studied during my 2 years in Toronto was Latin paleography, the study of ancient script. And I have to say that after trying to read the chicken track scribbles of Thomas of York in Xeroxed copies under the impatient eye of Reg O'Donnell, real medieval manuscripts held no fears for me. With a stroke of what can only be called beginner's luck, I found a small group of unpublished Latin poems in a manuscript in the University Library in Cambridge, which, on investigation, turned out to come from the school of one of the most influential bishops in 10th century England. I published the first edition of these poems in the first volume of the journal Anglo-Saxon England, whose editor, the late Peter Clemos, was also the professor of Anglo-Saxon in Cambridge. He was impressed enough with my initial discovery and with the possibility that more such discoveries awaited in manuscript that he created a lectureship for me in Cambridge in the field of insular Latin literature, that is, Latin of the British Isles. And so a chance discovery in a Cambridge manuscript led miraculously to a teaching career in the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic in Cambridge. Spurred on by my beginner's luck, I began to search systematically through manuscripts written in Anglo-Saxon England, in libraries in Cambridge, Oxford, and London, but also on the continent, especially in Paris. From these searches, a surprising amount of previously unknown prose and poetry came to light, nearly all of it religious, of course, saints' lives in particular, and nearly all of it composed in monasteries. These discoveries helped to flesh out the history of Anglo-Latin literature in the centuries before the Norman conquest. More interestingly, because Anglo-Latin verse was based on the imitation of Christian Latin poetry of late antiquity, it became possible to reconstruct the Latin school curriculum which the poets had studied by observing which Latin verse was being imitated and adapted. Then, by analyzing the ways in which these Christian Latin and classical Latin poets were glossed and annotated in manuscripts written in England, it was possible to build up a picture of the workings of an Anglo-Saxon school and the predilections of Anglo-Saxon schoolmasters. In addition, by recording all verbal echoes of earlier Latin literature, not just poets, that is, I found it possible to reconstruct the contents of a number of Anglo-Saxon libraries whose books have otherwise disappeared without trace, and in this way to begin to comprehend the Anglo-Saxons' intellectual universe. Arguably, the most important result of this line of inquiry was the realization that the Latin poets of Anglo-Saxon England, not only the Latin poets, but also those who composed Old English verse, had been trained in Anglo-Saxon schools through the same curriculum of Christian Latin poets. In other words, that the corpus of Old English poetry was composed in the study, besides a pile of Latin books, by authors literate in Latin and not by illiterate bards twanging a harp and extemporizing before an audience of drunken lords in a beer hall. This realization will have important consequences for the way in which Old English literature is studied in the future. Of course, younger, more brilliant scholars, notably Andy Orchard, have developed this line of argument far further than I could have done. It's enough to say that Old English literature will increasingly be studied in the wider context of Anglo-Latin culture, a context which was scarcely imaginable 50 years ago. It is unnecessary to say that, whatever the role of chance and luck in the research career just described, it could not have been carried out without the training I received in Latin and paleography at the Center for Medieval Studies here in Toronto, which meant I was ideally prepared to make the most of the opportunities that chance offered. From the time of its foundation, the Center has required of all its doctoral candidates the demonstration of sound reading knowledge in Latin. The examinations in which this knowledge is tested are of a very exacting standard. Needless to say, I suppose, the Latin requirement is not popular with every doctoral candidate in the Center. But it is this demanding requirement, inter alia, which has made the University of Toronto one of the outstanding centers for medieval studies in the world today. I may be the first graduate of the center to have been awarded an honorary degree, but I certainly will not be the last, because graduates of the center are at the forefront of medieval studies wherever the discipline is taught, thanks largely to the Latin training. This is, in short, a universally acknowledged situation of which the University of Toronto can be justifiably proud, and long may it continue. Finally, let me address a couple of sentences specifically to today's graduands. I thank you for your patience in listening to my autobiographical ramblings, because I realize that few of you are medievalists and that the career of a medievalist must be of minimal interest to you. Yet I'm sure that as you all advance through your careers, you will realize the cardinal importance of your graduate training here at the U of T, and that your reflections on this training will probably take a form analogous to my own. I'm also sure that with this training behind you, you will go on to distinguished careers, and that in 40 years' time, some of you will be standing here in my place, receiving honorary degrees. It's unlikely that in 40 years' time, I'll be here to applaud you. So let me take this opportunity to congratulate you all and to wish you every future success. Thank you for listening.